Hi everyone, my name is Lucinda Curran and I'll be your host for today's Lead Experts Q&A panel. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We're recording this Q&A panel to make sure that it's available publicly afterwards. So if you're not speaking, I'll ask that you keep your microphones off, panelists excluded, so that we can hear from all of our experts. If you want to ask a question, please go ahead and raise your hand. And to do this, you click on the reactions button at the bottom of the screen under the videos, and then you can choose raise hand. So then I'll take the questions in the order that they're received, and I'll ask you to unmute before asking your question. It's also preferred that you have your camera on while you ask your question, but of course it's your choice whether you want to do that or not. Once you've had your question answered, please lower your hand again. And that way, that sort of drops you down from the top of the list. And if you have multiple questions, please understand that you can probably ask all of them, but we'll just ask one question at a time. So that way everybody will get a chance. So please, as soon as you've finished asking your first question, drop your hand and then you can raise it again and get back in the queue for asking. If you've got a question, please go ahead and raise your hand from now onwards. I also wanted to mention before we get going that the information presented and answers given is based on the knowledge and expertise of the panelists, and the lead group and the panelists will not be held liable for the consequences of any action or inaction taken by participants, listeners or readers. Alrighty, so let me introduce you to our amazing panel, which are all drawn from the lead group's technical advisory board. First off, we've got Professor Richard Banati. And he is an internationally recognized scientist with interdisciplinary research interests in the brain's innate immune system and the development of advanced medical imaging for the detection of subtle, non-obvious brain pathology. The tracer principle has applications far beyond neuroscience, such as the measurement of naturally occurring isotopes and the detection of hazardous trace contaminants as they bioaccumulate in water, food, and aerosols. The health of the environment is intimately linked to human health. Yet the actual pathways of contaminants into the human body and their impact on human health can be difficult to assess. In 2008, Professor Banati joined the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation as a distinguished research fellow to develop new applications of nuclear technologies to study biological material. The research of Professor Banati and his colleagues has, amongst others, received recognition through the biannual award of the German League for Research into Alzheimer's Disease. He is a regular public speaker, such as at the Blue Planet Scientific Forum of the International Atomic Agency and TEDx Sydney. Professor Richard Banati is a professor and foundation chair of medical radiation sciences at the University of Sydney and has held the positions of director and of the Ramaciotti Centre for Brain Imaging at the Brain and Mind Research Centre and University of Sydney node of the National Imaging Facility. He has also acted as German Academic Exchange Service Research Ambassador and is a Fellow of the Royal Society, New South Wales. He is the current chair and medical director of Mother's Milk Bank Charity and head of research development of SORR, an internationally active venture to remove pollutants before they enter our environment. So welcome, Professor Richard Banati. Next, we've got Elizabeth O'Brien, who is also known as Grandma Lead. She is unique in the world in being the mother of lead-poisoned children and the lead scientist and lead advisor for Lead Education and Abatement Design Group, Inc., and a charity that has provided answers to lead problems to tens of thousands of people from more than 150 countries over 3 decades. In 2004, she was awarded the United Nations of Australia Association World Environment Day Award for Outstanding Service to the Environment. And most recently, Elizabeth has published the Model National Lead Safety Policy towards a lead-safe world in consultation with the Lead Group's Technical Advisory Board, which is available for download and to pass on to your local government members. So welcome, Elizabeth. Over to Tim. Tim Pye is a founding member of the Lead Exposure and Poisoning Prevention, which is known as the LEAP Alliance, based in the UK, having previously worked with the Lead Group. Tim's experience with lead exposure derives from ignorant DIY work which caused contamination and minor elevation of his blood lead level. Through tackling lead hazards in his home, Tim has developed a knowledge of lead-safe testing and cleaning practices and uses these to help others. He has also gained knowledge of lead-related legislation, regulations, sources of exposure, and medical conditions. The LEAP Alliance aims to influence health and housing policy to better manage and mitigate lead hazards in the UK and collaborates with other UK and international groups. Welcome, Tim. Ananda, hello. Ananda has a background in science before she bought an old home in 2019. She learned about lead and how to renovate to keep her children safe. So she started Lead Aware New Zealand, or Lead Aware NZ, to help prevent others from unsafe exposure to lead as well. Welcome, Ananda. Brian Arndt is our other panellist, and he worked at the only oil refinery in New Zealand from 1965 until 1975 as a shift operator. Prior to that, he was a qualified engineer plus marine qualifications. Over the last 10 plus years, he's been researching organic lead and the associated scavengers. He has compiled multiple files detailing the associated medical and health issues caused by organic lead and its ionic metabolites. There are several articles about him on Google. So welcome also to Brian.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll start by asking some of the questions that I've got here for you while we're waiting for the questions to come in from our attendees. So first off, I'm going to ask this question, which I'll address first to Professor Richard Banati, and obviously if anybody else would like to answer as well, they are welcome to. So, why should and how can mothers and young infants be protected from exposure to lead?
For mothers and young children applies essentially what applies to everybody, adults too, and that is the avoidance of exposure. What might be different is that if it is a planned pregnancy, one might suggest that mothers who've had a history of exposure, and a history of exposure would mean having lived near a mine or having had an occupational exposure or certain hobbies, painting, glass, or living in a house built before the 1980s, to have their blood tested for lead levels. Brian Goulson, who I think must have been a member of the lead group at some time, or still is, did quite some groundbreaking work on how to test blood. There are a number of biomarkers, changes in the blood, but I think he very convincingly showed one should go for the real piece of information, and that is the level of lead in the blood. So, number one, is there a risk? Mothers can ask that themselves, or if they are in prenatal screening, that can be done. There's a certain level of prediction possible. Then, as I said, if it was a planned pregnancy, a period of diet, about 1 or 2 months, for 30 days would lead to a washout from some of the tissue. The major store or a major store, which would be the bone, of course, takes much longer to wash out. And the reason for that is that lead and calcium essentially exchange or are transporters. And that brings me to the final advice that is generally good advice from what the literature says, even for mothers who have not had known exposure of lead, but just a little bit, because lead is now so pervasive. And that is making sure that the diet has vitamin D, D3. It's good for other reasons as well, neurodevelopmentally independent from lead, and calcium. So that, and then in all decisions around nutrition, avoiding contaminated food. Now the question is, what is contaminated food? I think in Australia, food should be okay, but there could be sort of little private market gardens in the middle of Sydney or somewhere else where the soil is contaminated. I think particularly inner city places, or if you live near Harbour Bridge sheds an awful lot of heavy metals, particularly during periods when it's cleaned. So there will be brown sites that are $1 million homes, but still they are brown sites. So there would be a bit of a warning not to eat the vegetables from places like that. One food is dark chocolate. That depends a bit on the provenance, where it comes from, Ecuador, but there's also arsenic and cadmium in particular. It depends where to eat cocoa pits or pips, I think. No, pits. I'm a bit confused. With the shell has generally high levels of heavy metals. One wouldn't recommend that. Again, the doses are not super high, but just to go through it again, assessment whether there was an exposure in the home or professionally or elsewhere, avoidance of food that may be contaminated primarily through soil, and then calcium, vitamin D, and actually all the other E. I mean, that's a general recommendation. Australians are, interestingly, still, despite all affluence, mothers are not well balanced nutritionally. So fresh, clean food.
Yeah, I would just like to add that most backyard chickens' eggs in Australia contain too much lead. So commercial chickens are better, eggs are better, unless you go to the trouble of testing your soil and making sure that your commercial chicken feed is not leaded, your water is not leaded, the chicken coop is not covered with lead paint or galvanized materials used for water for the chickens. So yeah, if you can do all of that, you may be able to eat your own chicken eggs, but otherwise you're better off to buy commercial ones.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yes, look, there's some concern here in New Zealand, that we used an awful lot of lead in automotive petrol. And it is now not publicised, but I had an associate friend who told me that not so long ago, the government banned the use of lamb or sheep offals from 2 years old. And they put it down, said it as heavy metal levels in the lamb offal. So that's like the kidneys and the liver. That was a very commonly used food. And it's actually lead is in there. And that's come from the lambs cropping on the ground, or the sheep. And that is, I mean, you go 50 miles away from a house, it's not lead paint, it is lead from petrol. Our lead levels in the ground are unacceptably high, and it's causing a lot of concern. But again, it is very much hidden by government, and it's not being revealed truly what it is. And similarly, there's very little medical records as run by the Ministry of Health on organic lead usage and its associated scavengers? Thank you.
Thank you. Over to Tim.
At least in the UK and maybe other countries, it's hard to get a blood test. The doctors will just say what for, because they are not trained in lead poisoning. But what you can do is get a dust test, and it's perhaps worth mentioning the Dust 360 program, which runs, well, anywhere in the world really, but is available in Australia and the UK. So you basically send in your vacuum cleaner dust, and you can get a parts per million figure back from that, and other dust testing methods are available. So expectation is a lot of contamination from older houses where there is old paint that's failing, rubbing, flaking, and causing dust in the environment, and that's particularly relevant to children who are playing on the floor and a lot of hand-to-mouth activity.
Definitely, and I have to just draw Ananda in on this. Ananda in on this. I noticed the post that she'd put up on social media with the alligator paint with the school holidays activities. If you wanted to comment further on that paint as well.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I missed the question. I was just getting my daughter some food, even though we just ate dinner.
So we're just talking about the ways that lead is getting into possible food sources, and Tim was just saying about the paint and testing the dust from the paint, and Brian previously been saying about the high levels, particularly in the soil, especially from petrol.
I think another way it could possibly be doing that is farm outbuildings that have lead paint on the building or the roof, and if some of those may fall into disrepair or something happens, and then the animals have access to that paint on the wood or the roofing material. I heard from a friend that does environmental work that there was some really high red lead paint on a rooftop that they were replacing. I think they put it down or something, or it fell down, and the cows started licking it and they all died.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's much
are notorious for going crazy for the smell of lead, and they will mob and eat whole lead acid batteries if left out, in an old tractor, or they are attracted to it and will go stomping towards each other, and inevitably they do die. Yeah, so
or even if there was just lambs or any kind of animals that are around lead paint in the farm environment, I think that could definitely make it into the food supply too.
Sure. And back to you, Richard. I know you wanted to say something.
I'd like to make a comment that was sort of triggered initially by Brian. Leaded petrol has been phased out, but the problem, of course, persists. And the question is it abating over time? The answer could be quite possibly no. We haven't even seen what happens. And then to know that in the UK, which is, of course, historically exposed to lead, there isn't a tight surveillance is really a bit of a recipe for disaster. Imagine it was radioactive. You would have a hotspot wherever it emerged, and then it would distribute. You get a flat distribution for everybody a little bit. And then after a while, you get reaccumulation. And what I explained earlier on during pregnancy is a mix of fast release and reaccumulation. Now we get hotspots and distributions. And unlike radioactivity, the lead will remain. It will not decay. It has zero half-life. No, it has an eternal half-life, if you wish. And the question would now be to governments, what are essentially the 100-year plans to re-extract the fine dispersed lead, or find the areas where the lead reaccumulates? I have no direct answer for it, but we have sewage systems and agricultural systems where, in fact, one could and I think it's a 100-year project, gradually re-extract or do basically urban mining of the lead.
Yeah. And there's even some worm farming technology that is looking at reducing heavy metals in sewage sludge. But in China, I know human sewage sludge is regularly applied to agricultural crops, which just puts lead back into the food cycle, which is why you can't rely on any Chinese imported food to be lead safe.
Yeah, I think what I mainly said it because public sources often say, look, we've phased out the major source, it's getting better. But I think even having stopped, not perfectly, the release, it's not getting better, it's just continuing to redistribute. And the task is to find the accumulation points and put something in place, because in fact it could just as well get worse despite diminished release.
And it's also sediments, which would be accumulation points, and then waters, bodies of water, waterways. So yeah, it's all about stormwater going out to sea, taking the lead from paint and petrol into the oceans, coming back as foods that humans eat, and cycling over again and again, sewage, etc. Yeah.
Ananda?
I was just going to add to that. What you guys have been talking about is, there may be hotspots of lead in certain places, and then land use changes, or redevelopment, and it becomes a housing estate, or things get redeveloped into other uses, and then that can become a risk where it wasn't previously.
Can I raise a point that is of serious concern? The automotive lead use is still very much present in the way of aircraft fuel, that's in general aircraft, petrol-driven aircraft, race fuel. I was talking to a young fellow who said, I just love that sweet smell when I go to the racetrack. And I said, son, I wouldn't go near it because that sweet smell is lead bromide. Now, the aircraft fuel, they are now saying that it is an unsafe area with a 20-mile radius around small aircraft airfields because of the lead bromide that's spewed out from the exhaust. Now, there's also been surveys done in England, in London, parts of America, where residual lead bromide dust coming off buildings still on the ground is there in absolute quite alarming quantities. I talked to a toxologist from WorkSafe New Zealand, a chap Rod Dixon, very knowledgeable gentleman, and he said that the lead from the automotive use and also from the storage facilities like petrol stations, where they used to have old steel tanks that got porous and leaked, that disposal of that is of major, major concern. And he says the toxicity of the organic leads is possibly in the tune of 1,000 years. In fact, he said, I would rate it worse than nuclear waste. And just for not a pleasant conclusion, lead is still being manufactured in the world for automotive race fuel and aircraft fuel in China. There is 2 uncontrolled lead plants in China.
And for marine racing boats as well.
But
any race fuel there, that's all race fuel.
Tim?
The only legal production of tetraethyl lead is in the UK.
No, that's closed down now. Innospec is closed, they were supposedly. Is that not correct?
I've not heard that. Oh, I'll check that out.
Where did you hear that from, Brian? And why wasn't I told?
No, it was actually publicised by a paper done by the American EPA, because the Innospec plant was owned by the original parent companies so of General Motors, DuPont's, and Standard Oil. The descendant company ExxonMobil is still very present. It's very quite highly placed here in New Zealand. In fact, it's the major shareholder in the old refinery, which is now called Channel Infrastructure. And I wonder they're just here to cover their butts and try and keep it secret squirrel.
I came across another sort of use of or reuse or reintroduction of the use of lead in the research for novel aviation fuels made out of plastic bottles. Overtly a good thing, but the additives make actually that fuel far more poisonous. And one of the additives is lead. Not only lead. So there is a gain on one hand, and it is lost because the properties of these, let's say, recycling-based fuels need to be improved, and then one is back to old solutions. So I think Brian, I wasn't fully aware on how much the automotive or transport industry lead source is still a major concern and continues to be one. And then the other that you mentioned is aging infrastructure, bridges, you name it, is going to release. So I think if one were to survey, we might well be ahead of a spike release. So we've come down from a high level of emission, but with other sources, uncontrolled sources and undocumented sources. And I think that's the big problem, that we don't really have good grasp of where is the lead and where will it be, where does it release?
Okay, I can tell you something on like the Harbour Bridge in Auckland. There was a sludge trap for water, the drainage water coming off the bridge. And there was a poor chap was put in there to empty it because it had been forgotten for years and it was full and overflowing. And he worked for a whole day digging out this trap and putting it into scrap bins, where it was taken away and just disposed in a landfill tip. But he got lead poisoning and he now died. And what he died of was from the lead bromide, the exhaust dust out of the exhaust. When absorbed into the body, it metabolizes into two ionic leads, and that is the real danger one, is that ionic lead compounds, which is triethyl and diethyl lead. And it actually is really awful. It passes the blood-brain barrier. It gets into the neurological system. It gets into the intestines of the body. I know because I'm suffering with it now. It gets around the heart. It causes a multitude of problems. Lead bromide.
Yep.
Yeah. I think for most of what we can do, as this is a 100 years project, quite possibly, is just simple advice like take your shoes off when you come indoors. That's not common practice in the UK. I don't know about over there.
Well, it is in my house. There's a mat there, and I say to people, take your shoes off or don't come in.
Yeah. So, and also that applies to pets as well, which might be more difficult. But
yeah.
We actually do foot wipes for our dogs when they come back in because we live in the inner city. So that's what they're walking in. They get good clean before they come back in again. So there's ways.
But I think the important thing is about trying to get this message out to the general public, because it's very easy, very simple way. And we've got to look, I think we have to look for cheap, quick, easy ways of reducing the risk, because the risk is going to be there. So let's manage the risk rather than, if we sit back and say, well, we have to eliminate the risk, it's not going to happen. But if we can reduce it, then that's just going to, everything's dose dependent. There's no threshold. So
there's a major concern with the change of energy use going to like EV cars, that petrol stations are decreasing in numbers. Now, up until recently, steel was used as the holding tanks under the forecourts of the service station. Now, over time, these steel tanks corrode and they start to leak. Now, the area, they're taking these tanks out and they're cleaning out the tanks, and then they dig around the peripheral area of where the tank was to take all the contaminated soil. Now, the disposal of that contaminated material is not controlled at all. I know of a case where 15 men in Auckland were put into from 6:30 at night till 5:30 in the morning to empty out what was a large service station that had now become defunct. They actually worked like they whipped the tanks out, dug the ground out around the tanks, all appropriately done, and that was taken off and dumped. The tanks were taken to the Glenbrook steel mill just southwest of central Auckland and re-smelted down. I got phoned up nearly 3 years ago now by a regional council officer at 6:30 in the morning saying, "Brian, can you help us please? We've got a problem. You're known as the lead man." I said, "What's the problem?" "There's two guys," he said, "are in palliative care. One died last night. The other one is still barely alive." He's fessed up and he said, "I think the problem why I've got these multiple cancers came from that damn service station job we did." Now I said, "Okay, you got to find where they put all the wastage that came out. You know, the tanks went into the steel mill, but what happened to all that wastage? Tons of it." And it was to put into a marshland swamp adjacent to the Waikato River, 1.2 kilometres upstream from where the new Auckland Water bulk pickup point is for water for reticulation into the city of Auckland. I said, "You've got to get it out." It then came to light. He said, "Well, we've now got to," he phoned me back, "we've got a problem." 2 days later, he said, "This marshland has been used for years and years as a dump site for toxic waste from service stations because the guys didn't know what the hell they were dumping." So what they've done, because they couldn't do anything else, they've put a large layer of clay over this marshland and it butted onto the Waikato River. They've built up a river bank with clay, planted willow trees in it, put soil on top of the clay, and it's now a large paddock area of quite a few hectares, a very large area, and they're grazing stock on the stuff, for goodness sake. I don't know.
Sure.
Can I ask, Brian, who regulates the decommissioning of petrol stations? I'm asking that in New Zealand. I'm asking that because I'm currently assisting in a project in Lake Tuggerah where along a jetty we discovered release of hydrocarbons, but with the hydrocarbons come all the additives and of course the heavy metals. We're trying to backtrack in the stormwater system where it comes from. So who regulates that disposal? Because what you've described, a relatively untrained personnel removes it and then it goes into landfill and the problem is just shifted.
Okay, in answer to that, there was in the 60s and early 70s was the Department of Health, as the Ministry of Health was then called, that any sludge contaminated materials should be put into 3-metre square trays with the ability that a lid could be put on top of them in inclement weather. Now, the lead sludge should have been placed in those trays up to a depth of 5 centimetres. The trays were to have a steel edging of up to 20 centimetres, so there was a good safe barrier. And then they suggested they were going to use lime or calcium oxides to spread on those. That guys suitably dressed with a respirator type face mask would then rake and stir those every day or every 2 or 3 days as required, and that they were covered up in inclement weather so they didn't get flooded with water. And then when that lead levels had got down, had calcified to an acceptable level, that sludge or the sediment should be put into polymerized concrete blocks. The blocks should be then wrapped in vinyl or plastic of some sort, sealed, and they should be put in a dry dump site where any leachate was controlled and tested, and the area fenced off, duly signposted as a hazardous area, and it monitored forever. That's not being done because it's too expensive. So just randomly they're dumping it in sites. There's a site here where I live in Matamata. About 4 years ago, I happened to drive past on a Sunday and I saw some guys digging out the tanks. I didn't want to go right the top, so I stopped at the edge of the site and called out, "Hey, come over here, I need to talk to you." I said, "What the hell are you guys doing?" He said, "Well, who are you?" I said, "No, I'm asking the questions. What are you doing with those tanks and the material you're digging out and the sludge you've got from the tanks there? There was a pile of it." I was told to bugger off. So I went to the council first thing the next morning and I raised Cain with the council. To this day, they have not been able to find where that sludge and earthworks was put, and the site is still fenced off and still not being used, and there's a very disappointed landowner who paid a lot of money for a site, and now 4 years later it's still got scaffolding fence around it, isolating it, and it's just a rack and ruin of weeds and bushes growing. It is randomly done right throughout New Zealand. Ananda, you may recall about 2.5
I was going to say that I think
No,
there's a
hang
lot
on.
of stuff
Let
that
me
slips
say
under
this.
the radar, but if things are done properly, it would be done.
It's not done. Do you remember down Dunedin?
Standard and then Ministry of
Excuse me.
Environment.
You know, hang on, down Dunedin, there was 3 little villages east of Dunedin that got lead poisoning. People were admitted to hospital with blood leads up to 400 parts per million in their bodies. I spoke to the Dean of Chemistry at Otago University. I know him personally. And I said, "Malcolm, can you get some of those patients and get urine samples from them?" And he said, "What for?" I said, "Test for diethyl lead." He phoned me back in 3 days after that call I made to him. He said, "Brian, you're right. There's diethyl lead in their urine. Where the hell did it come from?" I said, 9 months before this event happened, there was a heavy rainfall up in the tops of the Otago basin up in the hills, and the river flooded and a landfill site got eroded and there was all rubbish floating down the river. I said that there's been illegal dumping of wastage has gone into that landfill. You've just proved the point. The public and the Ministry of Health finally came out after a month and they waved a set of plumbing taps and said, "This is the problem because the lead that's in the bronze and brass is leaching out into the water, and it was old plumbing." The plumbing they showed was a model of plumbing that wasn't 15 years old. And that's what we're fighting, is to get recognition of what the heck is going on. And as I say, it's the ionic leads that are formed from the lead bromide, and that gets into the body, goes into the bones, then it comes out after years, or as the bones weaken with lack of calcium intake as people get older, and then that turns into ionic triethyl lead and diethyl lead. And I'm living proof of that's what it does.
Elizabeth, can I ask a question? Is there already a reasonably comprehensive lead distribution map, or could that be constructed with the help of apps? So you basically have a sort of, what is it called? The public basically assists in the monitoring of the environment.
Citizen science?
So public, yeah.
The only one I know is run by Dr. Mark Taylor, Professor Mark Taylor from Macquarie University, and currently the director of Victorian Environmental Protection Authority. He has put up a lot of the information from the 360 dust analysis, which is vacuum dust heavy metals levels, and also the Garden Safe, which is the Victorian EPA's version of what used to be run by Macquarie University for garden soils, and called VeggieSafe, and that data is all mapped. So it's very focused on inner cities and, you know, people who have connections with the university or the you know, now the EPA, but it is the only mapping of dust, vacuum dust and soil lead, as well as other heavy metals levels that I'm aware of in Australia. So,
in the UK, the British Geological Service and Society did do a review of contaminants in soil on about a 1 kilometre squared basis. So it does show hotspots of lead contamination across the UK, which is
what they did one sample every 1 square kilometre.
Yeah.
Just randomly, not near a building or near a road or near some source.
It's useless. And unfortunately, I've got one case where the local council is using that data and saying there's no lead contamination in the soil. Here's the evidence. But of course, it wasn't taken right next to an old house where kids were playing in the soil. So it's it is a mapping, which was Richard's question, but it isn't any use in predicting lead exposure.
Yeah.
Now, there are the hydrology maps that in all likelihood can be very precise, because if there's development, one could take an existing map of the hydrology and then look, are there likely areas, if there was an illegal dump or known the repository of some sort, that one could say, look, we need to check there. So rather than square by square being led by the hydrology, because that would be a major pathway, so heavy storm. So the stormwater drains, I mean, I'm not sure how easy that is. We know Sydney's sewage system is very old and probably very contaminated and leaks all over the place, but won't be much different in the UK, of course. But that would be a way to go from an existing infrastructure and a known very high resolution map.
Yeah, there's been some in the UK, some analysis of rivers downstream from lead mining sites that have showed, of course, high contamination in those rivers. And there's also a survey, very few data points, but in the seabed, and identified some variation in the amount of lead. And they've also looked at it, whether it's increasing or decreasing, and several places are still increasing. So we do have some data, but it's not really indicating human exposure. I think that's much more important. What's happening in your house? And that's where I think what Elizabeth's saying is that the Dust 360 analysis, which is not only in Australia, I mean, there is data all around the world.
Actually, I haven't looked on the mapmyenvironment.com, which I've just texted in the chat here. The URL is www.mapmyenvironment.com. I haven't looked there to see if it's more than just Australia. I've only ever looked for Australia, sorry.
Yeah, last time I looked, 146 points in the UK. And I do know that there is more data that hasn't yet been entered. So,
right. And it's just dust, not soil yet in the UK?
Yeah, we haven't got VeggieSafe. So people at Northumbria are not doing that. But also there's a big set of data around Indianapolis. So somebody there is doing it. And there's some data in Nigeria as well. Strangely.
Right. Is that Professor Mielke doing that in America?
Might be, yeah. Is he?
And that reminds me, there is a Laidlaw site of soil mapping in Australia. He's put together a whole pile of data from different studies. Yeah, so
I wonder too, Elizabeth, if the data that's been collected with all the lead kits perhaps could be one day put into some sort of mapping.
Yeah,
That would be really handy.
I definitely had that in mind for the last 8 years, and have been hamstrung by lack of funding and lack of volunteers who would have the technical skills to put the data online. But it's certainly in the works. It's part of my vision, and has been for a very long time. So yeah, we know that we'd have to, honour the privacy of our kit purchasers by ensuring that there are no names or addresses in there. And Professor Taylor has mentioned that there is a program you can get to sort of scramble an address so that you can insert an address into the mapping program, and then it will just squiggle it a little bit so that nobody could actually go to that address and know that your house is the one that's contaminated, to protect people's property values. And so that's all very possible. It's just a matter of I'd need to win the lottery at this point, or be that good that we actually get a government grant for that kind of thing.
Is there mapping of public buildings, schools, kindergartens?
Oh, certainly not. No.
That would have traction. You could possibly not argue against that also being funded, because these are public buildings.
Yes, but someone would have to pay for the public buildings to be assessed and and analysed, and then to be to have that data uploaded. It's a is there Tim's just asked, should we bring in Gerard or invite him specifically? I did send a text to Gerard asking if he would like to.
I have as well. So the moment he arrived, I asked him to let us know if he has a question, and I'm guessing that because he hasn't raised his hand, he may not have a question, but perhaps he doesn't know where that raising hand is. So Gerard, if you do have a question, do you want to just unmute and come and ask it? You're very welcome to. I'll also just point out that we're coming towards the end of our time together, so we will need to be wrapping up fairly soon. So just
hi, sorry. I don't have any questions. It's the first time I joined with your group here. I got lead poisoning myself 20 odd years ago, and that's why I'm interested in following what's happening here. But it sounds a little out of my depth anyway. But I'm interested to hear what's being spoken about.
Well, we're very interested to hear about your case, Gerard. What was the source of your lead exposure?
I had an old character colonial villa built in 1918 in Nelson, and I got some painters in to repaint it, and they were bloody cowboys and made a mess of it. And I thought I'd do it myself. I'd followed the recommendations of the Department of Health back in its day, and still got extremely poisoned by the lead paint for sanding and scraping it off. Oh, I didn't do the highest, I just did the rough patches, of course, but it was enough to kill me. And
sorry, you said it was a caravan, and can I ask what state or country?
No, character colonial villa.
Oh, a villa. Okay, right. Colonial being 1900 or something.
Yeah, 1918. Yeah.
18, right.
And I knew it would have lead paint, and I got a brochure from the whatever they call themselves back then, Department of Health or something like that, and followed their protocols and still got really sick from it. So
it's and if you're in Australia, then it was probably the Department of the Environment, which has changed its name 20 times since in the last 20 years. But they've still got a 2014 version of what's called this Lead Alert 6-step guide to painting your home. And I've told them that they really need to update it because the amount of lead in new paint has gone down in 2021. So the booklet needs to move up its stringency for dealing with lead paint, to notice that, you know, we're in a new era of actually having new residential paint meet the World Health Organization's definition of non-lead paint. So whereas in as I understand it, in New Zealand and the UK, they're still in the dark ages on that score. And
can I just chime in?
You can still have 1,000 ppm in the paint here, but it's not the way it is. But you know, it's past the allowed level.
Can I ask Gerard, if you don't mind, could you tell us what your symptoms of lead poisoning have been? How has it affected you?
Oh, that's quite a long story, but I'll keep it brief. I got severe brain damage. I couldn't read for over 10 years. I had very poor cognitive function. I couldn't take care of myself, basically. I didn't have the ability to comprehend how severely disabled I was for it all. And plus, I ended up with severe, ultra severe multi-chemical sensitivity. I lived under a rock for about 18 years. And I also had electrohypersensitivity. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's extremely sensitive to radiation from cell phones, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and all that stuff. Yeah, that's the basic main character. Oh, yeah, the main characteristics.
Wow,
Jared?
I'm very sorry to hear that. What do you think could have been done by government or industry to have prevented this?
Well, the brochure I picked up at the time from the Ministry of Health wasn't adequate to recommendations to protect oneself. I probably assume it's better nowadays, but
you in New Zealand, when you talk about the Ministry of Health, I'm thinking New Zealand. Whereabouts are you? Oh, you are in New Zealand. Okay.
Yeah, I'm up the Kapiti Coast at the moment, north of Wellington.
Oh, you're in New Zealand. Well, that's funny because currently there's absolutely no government action on
New Zealand
alerting people.
Yeah. Where are you guys all from?
I'm in New Zealand.
Australia, and Professor Banati is normally in Australia but currently in Italy, and Lucinda, the panel organizer, is in Australia, and then Brian Arndt, New Zealand, and Tim Pyers in the UK.
Ananda's New Zealand.
Okay.
So, Gerard, I'd love to ask you to just make the most of the expertise here and ask whatever you want to ask.
I'm just in the last couple of years doing much better after I connected with a doctor who got a DNA report done for me, and we looked into the epigenetics of everything, and it's because I was quite surprised at the time how early on in the piece, a year or two after I got the lead poisoning, I connected with a person who had lead poisoning as well, and we both had a hair analysis done. That's how I found out I had lead poisoning. And she was way over the edge of the chart, far more than I was, but nowhere near as severely affected as I was. And I think my DNA report showed why I was so severely affected. And since then I've been taking a lot of supplements that have been supporting my epigenetic profile.
You could swap notes with Brian Arndt. He takes a massive number of supplements for removing the lead from his body that he acquired in 10 years working at the New Zealand oil refinery, petrol refinery. So, I think, how do we, I guess Lucinda has your email address, and we could in fact start
you'll have my email address. Yeah.
Okay. I can make the connection if you would like me to.
Yeah, sure.
Feel free. Please do.
All right. I can do that. I think it's just wonderful that you're here, Gerard, and you've got the people here to actually ask whatever you like. And also it's really lovely that Brian's happy to do that with you and to share that information and help each other, support each other. And, it can help much more widely as well. If we can sort of share that information, obviously anonymously, but, share what helps each other. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can email you my info pack, which I've incorporated some of Brian's supplements that live on vitamin C, for instance, the lipospheric vitamin C, into, so that you can see what other people have done to take.
Yeah, I got early stages of cancer of the liver about 5 years ago, and I got put on a liposomal vitamin C back then as well.
Great. Okay.
Yeah,
Actually, can I help you there also? Along with your liposomal vitamin C, or as I use lipospheric, you should take some psyllium at the same time or 15 minutes afterwards, because that becomes a mild chelation agent. And I've still got lead coming out of my bones. My teeth, when they were measured in 2016, I was 1,659% above normal control. Last, literally, of the old leaded men, about 40-odd guys, operators, are all dead. They were marked off in 1977.
Yeah. Just by the way, I'm 67 as well of age. I haven't been able to work since the left in 2001.
And I believe Tim Pye is about to turn 67 next Monday, is it?
Oh, I
Happy
don't know.
birthday, Tim.
Here as well.
I'm almost old enough to call you all son and daughters. I'm over 83.
Yeah, very good.
Yes, it's I would just want to say that really ties into some work I'm doing with the Wasteman's residential lead group, because they're trying to, or together we are trying to get the government in New Zealand to do something about lead, to have some kind of organization or cohesive something that can try to work on prevention. And putting leaflets in the DIY stores is one of the things that we talk about sometimes, because, it's funny you mentioned that there used to be one, because right now there isn't anything. And even the Ministry of Health guidelines for dealing with lead-based paint is like from the 90s. I think it's super outdated. Like, it's embarrassing.
Wow.
So there's a lot of work to be done here.
I don't know whether you've got a trade association in the UK. We've been meeting with what's called the British Coatings Federation and the Painting and Decorating Association, and they're been really positive and helpful, and want to see if they can get leaflets into stores and more information onto their websites and out to their members. So if you have rather than going through the government, try going through trade associations. But in my experience so far, that's a much more positive response.
Yeah.
Obviously, because they must think about liabilities down the track. Can I ask a question, maybe whoever can answer it? If you were to design a stormwater on-site first pass lead capturing device, what would that look like? Let's say there is something downstream from a petrol station, that sort of sludge trap. How would you, at least to reduce the impact, how would you construct that? What would it consist of?
Yeah.
Well, there's one answer that has come up from that, and they're using it in the States in severely contaminated sites, is they're putting in sump pumps and putting the water through activated carbon filters, which seems to pick up the lead and the lead bromides and other heavy metals that might be there. And then as the filter gets blocked, choked, they actually hopefully put it into polymerized concrete and then bury it in an improved dry dump area. I believe that's what they're doing.
And again, worm farming, as long as you can actually pick up the desiccated bodies and detritus of the worms in order to remove them from the environment, after they've taken heavy metals out of, contaminated soil, sediments, sewage, that sort of thing, you may be able to get somewhere with worm farming. There's an Australian Vermitech company that started in Broken Hill 15 years ago, or 20 years ago. It's it's worth having a look at Vermitech.
Vermitech.
I think
Elizabeth,
there's
you have more.
I've seen some papers about clays, that some of the clays bind the heavy metals, and then you can regenerate the clays to get the heavy metals off and then continue to reuse them. I don't know what kind of scale that would work on.
Why I'm asking the question is, you mentioned it in your introduction. I'm currently assisting a venture sustainable oil recovery and remediation. Currently, oil spills are treated with sorbents, and for whatever 1 million liter of oil, you end up the equivalent of your sorbent. And that venture has developed a type of sponge that physico-chemically allows it to extract hydrocarbons, and then you can reuse the sponge and you extract the oil. So you don't multiply the waste volume to the same degree. Incidental observations are that this material also retains heavy metals. It isn't primarily manufactured for that purpose. It wasn't meant to do that, but it seems to do that partially. And as you mentioned, activated carbon, most of the waste is mixed waste, and it could well be that there's a hydrocarbon fraction in there that would then possibly reduce the useful lifetime of an activated carbon filter. So that's why I was asking, what are the types of waste and how could these traps, waste traps or lead traps, be improved? And if any of you has knowledge where they are being deployed specifically to remediate waste, please let me know, and I'd like to basically look at the engineering solution, but also whatever components they've put into this, just to see how effective are they, or whatever, after one rain it's all over and they needed to change it, which they don't, because that's what usually happens with filters. They work a little bit and then they're not maintained because they're too expensive or not effective.
Yeah, the CRC, the Center for Research on Contaminated Land, is typically where I would refer people for solutions to contaminated land. Yeah, they're based in Adelaide, I understand it.
Yeah.
We're a little bit over time now, so I'll actually defer to Gerard. Gerard, did you have any final questions or anything that you'd like to ask the panel while we're all here together?
No, I'm all good, thanks, sir.
Alrighty, and I'll go ahead and connect you with Brian afterwards as well via email.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And me too, yeah. I'd love that, yeah.
So Gerard, is that okay with Elizabeth as well?
Yep, sure.
Brilliant, thank you, because I will never do that without asking first. Okay, so what I'll be doing after this is turning this into a blog post and having this on our website so that people can actually watch the replay. Excuse my puppy barking in the background. But for now, I'd like to thank from the bottom of my heart to everybody for actually coming along to be and being part of this amazing panel and sharing your incredible expertise and experience and just sharing so many brilliant ideas and being a beautiful team. So thank you. I'll go in order of who I can see. So thank you to Brian. Thank you so much for being here and coming all the way from New Zealand. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you to Tim, all the way in the UK.
Thank you. Breakfast time now.
Breakfast, yay. Thank you, Ananda.
Welcome, and thanks for organizing it.
You're welcome.
To bed.
Yay, thank you. And thank you to Professor Richard. And thank you also to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Lucinda. You've been great.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, morning, wherever you're at in the world. And we look forward to catching up with you another time. Bye, everyone.